Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Monday, July 22nd around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking about the ACC Media Days. They kick off today over in Charlotte, North Carolina, and we'll break down all of the biggest talking points. Obviously, the biggest talking point is going to be Florida State and Clemson and the pending legal cases against the ACC, but we'll see how that unpacks, and we'll get into some other talking points as well. Then we'll get into kind of an interesting conversation that has been happening for quite some time in college football. Who is the most competitive conference? Who is the best conference? Who are the teams that play the closest games? We'll break all of that down on today's show. Tom Fornelli did us a huge favor by compiling all this information, so we'll break it down on today's show. Then we'll get into Texas A&M. It feels like the Aggies are getting a little bit overlooked this season, likely because of how underlooked, I suppose, they were in the previous years under Jimbo Fisher, but Mike Elko is exactly where he wants to be, and we'll break down how I think the Aggies might just be a really dangerous team in the SEC this upcoming year. Then we'll get into a little bit of a recruiting update. We have LSU just absolutely tearing up the weekend. A number of big-time players came off the board. Florida got a huge commit, so we'll break down everything there. And then we'll get into kind of a new segment around here. I'm going to do contenders hot takes, so something around all of the contenders across every single conference. I'll break down a hot take I have for their season, but we'll get into that slowly throughout the week. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's always good for the both of us. Again, if you want to use that, that's gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump right in, because the ACC Media Days get underway today over in Charlotte, and there's a ton to break down. There's no two ways about that. This is the conference that is likely under the most turmoil going into this season, not only on the field but off the field, and it's going to be a very interesting year on the field as well. But obviously, there's going to be so much to talk about, and a lot of it is going to be taken up by Clemson and Florida State. But first, before we get into all the talking points, let's just break down the schedule for this week. You obviously have today, you have the commissioner, which is going to be fascinating to hear from him, hear what he has to say about everything that's going on around his conference. You have Florida State, Georgia Tech, a new SMU team coming in, and then Day 2 is a little bit more tame. You got Cal, Pitt, Stanford, Virginia Tech will be fascinating to hear from. And then Virginia, Tony Elliott kind of starting to pick up steam just a little bit in Charlottesville. And then you have Boston College, Duke, Louisville, Miami is the show of the week if you were to ask me. And then Wake Forest on that Wednesday. And then you close it out with Clemson, North Carolina State, and Syracuse. So we kind of bookend it with the two teams that everyone wants to hear from the most, Florida State and Clemson. But will definitely be a huge week for a number of things. But let's start right there with Florida State and Clemson, because they're going to be the talk. There's no two ways about that. And it's going to be all the off the field stuff that is going to be the most talked about thing. Obviously, you want to hear from the officials at these universities, the head coaches. Jim Phillips, more than anyone else, is who I want to hear from. But I do think there's going to be a little bit kind of an interesting approach, especially from the coaches here, where Dabo and Mike Norvell, the best you're probably going to get out of them is essentially, I'm focused on football right about now. I'm not necessarily worried about all the outside stuff. They'll worry about that, and I will just do my job, which is to coach football. That doesn't mean we won't get plenty out of this. We're going to get tons of university officials. We'll get some ADs possibly on record. We'll get different people from different backgrounds kind of interacting, and that tends to give us a little bit of juice around some of these topics. So it'll be really, really interesting to see what happens today and going forward throughout the week. But if Florida State and Clemson want out by 2025, a decision has to be made here pretty soon. So I have to assume we're going to hear something, whether it's, Clemson and Florida State are gearing up to make that decision and possibly jump to the Big 12, which seems like the only landing spot at this point, or we'll hear the opposite, say they're going to stick around for a little bit, try to kick the tires on the SEC and Big 10 a little bit more, and that would be a very interesting thing for the ACC going forward with just how that would work between those three entities. But at the end of the day, there's also big-time questions on the football field, and Jim Phillips obviously cannot necessarily answer those, so there's going to be tons of questions around these two teams on the football field, because they're the two teams. They're the teams that are coming into this with the highest odds to win this conference, and there's some questions around him. There's no two ways about that. For Florida State, although we won't get to hear from DJ Uiagalelei, which is obviously very disappointing, but he did it for a very nice reason, letting the guys from last year get their shine and go to the ACC Media Days. But there's going to be tons of questions about those transfers, particularly on the offensive side of the ball, trying to figure out, who's standing out, who's, not necessarily carrying the weight you want. Malik Benson is going to be huge. Roydell Williams, I could go on and on about the offensive transfers that they need to hit. So it's going to be really interesting to hear from some of these guys about how that's coming along. Is that team, where they want to be, or are the transfers coming in and it's just a little bit slower going than it was maybe a year ago or something like that? So that'll be really interesting to watch. And then for Clemson, it's all around that guy. There's no two ways about that. I think when you talk about Clemson this year, it's all Cade Klubnik, Garrett Riley. If those two can find a way to get on the same page, to be in lockstep, this is going to be a really hard offense to stop, because they do have some wide receivers on the outside, finally, that are up to the Clemson standards. And they're freshmen, to be fair, but they're both really, really talented kids. And I'm fascinated to hear from Cade Klubnik about, obviously, his connection with Garrett Riley, but also how Bryant Wesco's doing, how TJ Moore is doing, if they can, really play roles early on in the season. I tend to believe that Bryant Wesco is going to trot out there with the first teamers in the first game of the season. So I think this is going to be a very, very interesting week for those teams. Obviously, off the field is going to dominate the conversation, but the reality is I do think there is going to be a ton of questions on the field as well for these teams. And then you get into the team that Anthony just asked about here, and I think is going to actually dominate the conversation the same way that Texas did a week ago at the SEC Media Days. It's Miami. Miami is the team that everyone is looking towards this upcoming year, because there's a lot of people that don't want Miami to come back up to the top of college football, and there's a lot of people that really want it to happen. So it's going to be really fascinating to watch this unfold, but there's going to be some questions. There's no two ways about that. Cam Ward will be in attendance, so getting to hear from him about his connection with Shannon Dawson and how his rapport is going with the receivers that have come in. Xavier Restrepo and him seem to have a very, very good relationship at this point, but definitely will be interesting to hear from him. You also have Francisco Mauanoa making his appearance. Will be great to hear from him, because he's the leader of that defense. He might be the outright leader of this team, if I'm being totally honest. And hearing from him about guys like Tyler Barron, like Simeon Barrow Jr., like other transfers that are filling, Michelle Powell on the back end, hearing from him will really give us an idea of just how good this defense can really be. And then what Anthony just said is the biggest question that I have for this is, will Mario Cristobal be willing to just hand the reins off? Will he be willing to just say, I really trust in my coordinators to make the right decisions at the right times, and not be as micromanagey as he has been on the other as he has been throughout his career? It's created some big time problems, including that just disaster of a Georgia Tech game at the end of the year. So obviously that's going to be a big topic of conversation, but it feels like this is Mario's program for the first time since he's really taken over. Obviously, year 3 is kind of that year when you have your team, but it really feels like this team everything is moving in the right direction. The only thing that can really get in their way is themselves, and kind of in that way. So it'll be really, really interesting to kind of unpack that a little bit. But I do want to get into, obviously, Cam Ward is going to be a huge topic of conversations among the quarterbacks, but there's going to be a lot of quarterbacks there. Just almost too many, if I'm being totally honest. There will be 19 quarterbacks in attendance, and there's only 17 teams in this conference. And Florida State's not sending DJ. So who are the teams sending to, and why are they sending to? Well, it starts with Duke. Duke is sending Malik Murphy, and they're sending Grayson Loftus. I think they're battling for that job. I don't think that's decided, and it very well could be decided in some form or fashion this week, depending on how they carry themselves in these interviews. But that's kind of a side point. I do think Grayson Loftus holds a little bit better of a position as of right this second, but when you talk about upside, I think Malik Murphy wins that battle by a fairly comfortable margin. And then you have Cal. They're bringing Francisco Mendoza and Chandler Rogers, and I think they haven't decided that one either. I would lean toward Mendoza making the first start, but I think Chandler Rogers, coming over from North Texas, is a very, very talented kid. I think UNC is bringing 2 as well. Max Johnson is battling with, I can't remember his first name. It's escaping me at the moment, but Harrell, they are battling for that spot. I think it's Max Johnson has the advantage right now, but who knows? I thought it was going to be just Max Johnson. It wasn't going to be a question, if I'm being totally honest. And then SMU is bringing 2 quarterbacks, which is interesting because it's going to be Preston Stone. He's going to be the starter. There's no two ways about that. But it sounds like they want to introduce you to the future of their program. They have a very, very talented young quarterback that absolutely will make some noise this upcoming year. So it'll be really interesting to watch that. And then you have some other guys. You have Cam Ward obviously coming, but Haynes King will be there. Thomas Castellanos, Kyle McCord, Grayson McCall, Cade Klubnik, Kyron Drones, Preston Stone. So many veterans that know so much about football and have played so much football, and it'll be really, really fascinating to hear from them. And then finally, you have the teams that are joining the league for the very first time. SMU being the team that is a little bit more of a dark horse in this company is definitely a very, very interesting thing. So it'll be really, really fascinating to watch how that kind of develops. And they're definitely a team that I think people should be circling just a little bit more in the ACC this upcoming year. And then you obviously have Stanford and Cal. I think they're kind of on the outskirts. Probably won't get too many sound bites from those two this week, but definitely a very, very interesting thing to watch. But I think there's going to be a ton of questions around the ACC and other talking points. You have Syracuse going into a very interesting year. Louisville, NC State, SMU, Virginia Tech, all of them are expecting big-time years. And then just watching Jim Phillips, every time he opens his mouth, something interesting is going to come out, whether it's for the ACC or against the ACC. And Anthony had some questions over here that I want to address, and I believe that SMU is the one bringing the two quarterbacks. Maybe I read that wrong. That is definitely a case. But I fully understand the not fully trusting Jim Phillips, because he hasn't necessarily knocked it out of the park, especially over the last little bit. He's definitely someone that has a lot to prove in this next little bit, that he can keep his conference afloat and he can compete with guys like Brett Yormark and Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti, because right now he's running fourth in that race, and it's a pretty distant fourth. So that's obviously a huge worry for the ACC, and they'll have to deal with that as they kind of go over these next couple of months. But the reality is this is going to be a crazy week, and it's going to be a crazy week not just because of the stuff that we'll hear on the football field, because frankly I think this is one of the most interesting conferences in the country, but everything off the field is going to be that much more important for this conference's future, for FSU and Clemson's future, for pretty much everyone else. It's going to be fascinating to watch, what happens with Clemson, and does it trigger UNC, NC State, Virginia, some of these other teams possibly joining in on this party. So it could be an explosive week. There's no two ways about that. Definitely will be a fascinating thing to watch. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to break down which conferences and which teams actually play the most competitive games. We always talk about the SEC and the Big Ten being the best conferences, but who are the most competitive? Who are the ones that you're tuning in pretty much every week, and you'll be able to find a number of games that are very close. But we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the ACC Media Days, and my guy Anthony over here just asked a fantastic question that I will answer next week. I promise that I am getting to all of my predictions going into this year, and they will start next week, and we'll kind of work through all of the big conferences, but that all of those questions will be answered in that segment next week, so I promise you that, but don't want to spoil anything too soon. But let's get into segment 2 here, and let's talk about who's the most competitive conference. The conversation about who's the toughest conference, who's always battling, who's the best conference has been something that has been around for as long as I can remember. There are so many people battling for that top position, and it's often leaned towards the SEC, with the Big Ten being very close behind. I think we all understand that there is a level of football played at the SEC level that seems to be above the others, but is that really the case? Or at least, does being the best mean you are the most competitive? It honestly doesn't, and it's something that has really shown itself. Tom Fornelli did a fantastic job putting together all of this stuff from 2014 to now, leaving out the COVID year because that was a very weird year for a number of teams. So breaking down some of the different things, and one of the biggest things was how many close games do you play? How many one-score games do you find yourself in throughout the year? And there are a lot of teams that find themselves in one-score games. We'll start with teams, and then we'll get into conferences here in a second. But let's start with the teams in the least amount of one-score games, and that could be for any number of reasons. So these are the games that you'll turn off late in the third quarter or early fourth quarter and go try to find something a little bit more interesting. And Rutgers leading this is not for the right reasons. I'll just put it that way. There are a couple of teams on here for the right reasons. Georgia, Ohio State, App State definitely, Michigan, Oregon. All of those teams are on here for the right reasons. Troy as well, another one. But the rest of them probably aren't on here for the right reasons. Probably are on here because they're not necessarily doing too hot during those later parts of that game. And Alabama just barely missed this list because, as you know, they found themselves in a couple of battles every single year, it feels like. And then you have Penn State, Tennessee, Arizona, SMU just off this list as well, or just off the top 10. So definitely some teams that absolutely blow out their opponents or don't do too well on Saturdays and people tune out of their games. But let's keep it moving here, and let's talk about the teams with the most close games over the last 6-7 years. Oh my god, a decade. Wow, time flies. But let's break it down here, and it starts with Virginia. It feels like Virginia is always that team that plays up and down to opponents no matter what. North Carolina may be the best example of that, if I'm being totally honest. And then you have the team that I think everyone expected to be on here, Texas, and they absolutely have to fix that. They played 5 one-score games last year, so it took the percentage down, but it was not easy for them to deal with a lot of the games that they had last year, and it's going to be a problem as they go into the SEC if this continues to be the case, because there's less one-score games that you can come out on top on in the SEC than the Big 12, because in the Big 12, you had a little bit more ability to kind of just lean on your opponent, just kind of force them to quit at some point because you were bigger, because you were more physical, because you were stronger, and you had that ability. You won't in the SEC, so it'll be really fascinating to watch that. Nebraska is obviously going to be on this list. I feel like they're in a battle every single week, so that's definitely one. Kansas State being on here is fascinating because they just win those games. They continuously win those really close games. Hopefully they can kind of get a little bit further away from that this upcoming year, but definitely a really, really interesting one that I didn't necessarily expect to be there at the end of the day. So I think it'll be really, really awesome to watch all of this unfold. But here, let me check out what Anthony's asking here. Yeah, I think there's a number of things that go into this. You know, I think Texas is a team that has walked into a number of games just thinking that they're better. I think Miami could fall into that category, although I think there's a little bit, maybe a little bit less of that, although definitely could be present. I think Texas is the one that I would circle as the team that just shows up to some of those games, you know, whether it's Iowa State or it's one of the lower level conference teams in the Big 12, and just says, we're bigger, we're stronger, we're more talented, we're going to win this game. And then they find themselves in a battle in the fourth quarter. So I think that would be the team that I would circle. But Miami absolutely is another one of those teams that might just toy around just a little bit too much with some of these lesser opponents and let them stay in the game. I think that's what happened in the Georgia Tech game, where you make too many mistakes, you kind of are a little bit lackadaisical at times, and one mistake can absolutely ruin that game for you. So that's definitely a team that I would watch, and definitely something that kind of plays into this a little bit. But let's get into the conferences, because that's the big question everyone has. Who plays the tightest games in across all the conferences? Well, it's the two conferences that I peg to be the most competitive this upcoming season, the Big 12 and the ACC, in that order. The Big 12 is leading the way. They are number one among all FBS conferences, so among the 10 that are up for it, they are number one, and then ACC is number two. So they're both right around 42% of games that are one-score games, which is absolutely incredible. It gives you an idea of why those games are so much fun, and why I think the Big 12 is the conference to watch this upcoming season, because I think that percentage might just go up this season. It's going to be absolutely crazy out there. The FBS average is around 38%, so they're definitely well above that and playing some really, really tough football over there in the ACC and the Big 12. The SEC and the Big 10 find themselves on the other side of this. The SEC in 7th place among the FBS conferences, about 37%, and then Big 10 all the way at the bottom at 10th in the conferences, 35%-ish for them playing those one-score games. So it kind of gives you an idea of how these conferences are structured a little bit. It's a little bit more the SEC and the Big 10 being defined by the big guys, and then everyone else kind of just fighting for that second or that third spot. And then you have the ACC and the Big 12, where it's just any given Saturday, just show up, lace them up, and we'll figure out what happens on the other side. But let's go to the inverse of this. Who has the most blowouts? Who has the most games that are won by 17 plus points? At least that's the way that Tom Fornelli broke it down. And same exact thing. ACC is number one, 37.67% of their games are blowouts, so not very many. Obviously, a lot of those come from Clemson over the last little bit, but definitely a very, very high moniker, or low moniker is what you want for this, but definitely a very, very interesting thing, and absolutely is something that really ACC can really hang their hat on. And then the Big 12 is not far behind them. They're third among all FBS conferences, about 40% here. The FBS average is right over 40% at 41.5. And then you have SEC and Big 10 in the exact same places they were before. Big 10 or SEC 7th among FBS conferences, and Big 10 dead last. So a lot of blowouts in those two conferences, and it breaks down just how the exact same thing that I just said here. It's definitely a very, very interesting thing to watch when you talk about these conferences, where the Big 12 and the ACC are a little bit more unpredictable and a little bit more closer and competitive every single week. Does that make them the better conference? I tend to believe no. I think there is a difference between who's the better conference and who's the more competitive. But at the end of the day, if you were to ask me, do you want to watch Georgia facing off against Tennessee, but Georgia wins by 17 and is up by 17 going into the fourth quarter, or do I want to watch Kansas State play Arizona and it goes down to the wire and someone wins it with a last-second kick? I'm picking the latter 10 times out of 10. So that is something that the ACC and the Big 12 can kind of hang their hat on. Obviously, it's not necessarily the greatest thing when you go into these rooms where you kind of have to pitch yourself as big brands, and you have to pitch yourselves as, you want to pitch the Georgias of the world. You want to pitch the Alabamas of the world. You don't necessarily have quite as much traction if you're pitching Clemson, who might be on the way down, or Florida State, who might be on the way out of the conference. And then in the Big 12, you have some teams that hold a little bit of weight, but not nearly the weight of the others in the Big 10 and the SEC. Like, Utah is a fantastic program, but if you put them in the same room as Texas, you're not fighting the same battle, and Utah is going to win that 10 times out of 10. So I think that's kind of the conversation here is, I tend to believe that the SEC and the Big 10 are the two best conferences in this sport, but part of me believes, that's not what makes this sport special, right? It's not about who's the best conference. It's not about who are the best teams in the country. It's not about, how many teams can absolutely just separate themselves from the pack. For me, it's about those games that go down to the wire, those nail biters, the ones that you're sitting on the edge of your seat, even if you don't care about the two teams playing in it, because it's that interesting. The one that comes to mind most readily is that Missouri-Kansas State game from a year ago, where just every single drive felt so important and so intense. And it's one of those games that obviously was out of conference, so applies a little bit less here, but definitely is something that the Big 12 has kind of been known for over the last little bit, and it's helped out that someone like Texas has been playing down a lot of the time. But the reality is, it is kind of just a preference more than anything else. You know, do you want to watch just elite athletes run all over the field and make ridiculous plays and possibly end the game up 21 like you find in the SEC a lot of the time? Or do you want to take just that slight step down? And it's really a very slight step. I understand the gap between them is growing and it feels like they're playing two totally different sports, but there's some really, really good football being played in the Big 12 and the ACC, and if it's really competitive too, then I'm all for it. So I think it's kind of one of those interesting conversations because best and most competitive are two totally different conversations, but competitive and interesting are directly correlated. So that's why I point to the Big 12. That's why I point to the ACC this upcoming year as the conferences to watch, because they might not just be the most interesting games in the world, but there's going to be a game. Maybe it's Syracuse, Virginia Tech. I don't even know if they play, but let's just throw that out there. That could be a game that goes down to the last very second because the ACC is just a little bit more unpredictable. So it's kind of that interesting battle of who's the best, who's the most competitive. Frankly, doesn't necessarily matter to me. As long as you're giving me good football, I'm all on board. So definitely would be a very interesting thing to follow over the next couple of years and see if the SEC and the Big Ten, with some of the new people coming in, can kind of close that gap, or if the ACC loses some teams, maybe that gap even gets a little bit bigger, or maybe it comes back down to earth. Who knows? So it'll be really, really fascinating to watch. But let's take our second break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Texas A&M. It feels like the Aggies are being just a little bit overlooked, but frankly, I think that's the way that Mike Elko and the Aggies like it around this time of year. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the most competitive versus some of the best conferences, and does it really all that matter? It's just a preference type of thing, so watch whatever football you want. You'll get plenty of good football in college football. But at the end of the day, let's move on to segment 3 here, and let's talk about the Texas A&M Aggies, because going into this SEC season, it's all about Texas. It's all about Georgia. It's all about Bama changing coaches. It's all about Ole Miss bringing in a ton of new players. Missouri trying to get a new big-time year. Even Oklahoma getting some love coming into the conference. But A&M just kind of sitting in the corner in the dark, just kind of waiting. And they're just going to work and doing exactly what Mike Elko really likes to do. And I think that's the biggest thing for me. And when they made that hire, that was the biggest thing, where you looked at who Mike Elko was compared to who Jimbo Fisher was. Mike Elko fits A&M just infinitely better. And maybe I'm alone on this. There might be some Aggie fans that can call me out on this, but almost from the jump, it felt like Jimbo Fisher was just not in the right place. It felt like that was just not quite the right place for him. Good morning. Aloha. Very, very cool to see a Hawaiian in here. But it just felt like Jimbo Fisher was just kind of a fish out of water. He didn't fit with whatever A&M was, and that sounds really ridiculous, and obviously fit is one of those things that matters and doesn't matter at the same time, but it just didn't feel like it was the right head coach for them. I think they do have the right guy now. I think he feels like an Aggie. I think he feels like the guy that is supposed to be leading this program for a number of different reasons. I think number one overall is he's a fantastic head coach. He does just incredible things pretty much wherever he goes. He was remarkable as the defensive coordinator there for a number of years. Then he moved on to Duke, and really coached in just incredibly good football. And it's one of those things that he moves kind of in silence. That's the way that he works. He came from a blue collar family. He's one of those guys that just goes about his business, goes to work, and then shows up on Saturdays and shows you the work that he put in. So definitely the approach that he's going to have throughout his time at A&M. And frankly, I think that's the right way to go about business. And I think some of their big-time players really love it. Trey Zune, the very talented offensive tackle for them, just said, we love the silence. We're doing our work, grinding every single day to put our best foot forward against Notre Dame. And I think that's the best approach that they can have. They're not going to be the team that is going to get all the talk. They're not going to be the team that dominates all the headlines going into this SEC season. They can be coming out as long as they are fully focused every single week, and especially that first week. So it's going to be really, really interesting to watch. But the reality is this guy is just awesome. I cannot speak highly enough about Mike Elko, and there was a brief moment where you thought it might just be Mark Stoops leading this program going forward. That was a very, very interesting, 48 hours more than anything else, where they made that decision on possibly Mark Stoops, and then that flipped around and it became Mike Elko in a hurry. Frankly, I think that worked out for the better for A&M. I think Mark Stoops, while a fantastic coach, I think it just wouldn't have fit quite as well. And maybe that I'm blowing that out of proportion just a little bit, but I do think A&M picked the right guy, and I think they're ready to move into the season with a lot of things moving in the right direction. I know there's a lot of talk around all the guys that left from that 2022 class and how that's, totally gutted at this point and not nearly as talented. They're still one of the top 5 most talented teams in the country. If you look purely at the roster, the talent level is off the charts insane. So it's not necessarily that's going to be an issue. I can almost promise you that. But they just came off their worst 2-year run since 2009, so they got to start moving forward. And there's a couple of things that make me feel pretty confident that they can do it. But let's get into their schedule first, because that's one of these big-time things. And it's kind of manageable. Obviously, it's an SEC schedule with Notre Dame as an out-of-conference opponent, so it's not like it's going to be easy by any means, but let's just work under the assumption that they win that Notre Dame game. If they win that Notre Dame game, there is an opening here that I don't even know if many A&M fans think that they have at this point. So I think that game is going to be absolutely huge. Obviously, in Kyle Field helps a ton, but after McNeese State, you go to Florida, another huge game. They have to be able to win that game if they want to continue on a really, really good path. And definitely, if you can beat Notre Dame, I like to think you can go into Florida and beat Florida, although it's definitely going to be very close because that environment gets loud in a hurry. But that'll be really, really interesting to watch. You have Bowling Green, obvious layup. Arkansas, for some reason, they're playing that in Jerry World again instead of playing that at home and home, but that's beside the point. You also have Missouri. Missouri's the other one that is the inflection point for me. I think if they can get that win, it's going to just do wonders for this team and open up a huge door for them where maybe you lose that LSU game, maybe you lose that Texas game at the end of the year, and you're still very much in the conversation for any number of things, the playoff, the SEC title, what have you. So it's going to be really, really interesting to watch. I think when I circle, a couple of games here, there are a couple of games that I think just have to be won, and if they are won, then things get really, really interesting. I think it's at Florida, you just have to get that win. Missouri, you just have to get that win, and then at Auburn at the end of the year, I think is huge. Going into that Texas game, you got to come out with a W, and you got to be able to go into that game with as much confidence as possible. If they go 3-0 in those games, then things get really interesting because, as you can see, Notre Dame, Missouri, LSU, Texas, all of those games are at home. The 4 biggest games on their schedule and the 4 games that could separate them from a playoff or an 8-4 season are all at home, and that's a huge benefit for this team and a huge benefit for the guy that's calling all the shots, and that's kind of what I want to get into. This roster is still just ridiculously good, and it starts, in my opinion, with the guy under center. Connor Wegman is one of the most important guys. He could be one of the most important guys in the country at the end of the year, and frankly, he could play himself into the first round of the NFL draft. That's how good this kid's tools are, and that's how talented he is with the ball in his hands. Now, the question is, can he stay on the field? Can he play a full season and play a consistently good season? Because if he does, I think there's going to be a number of NFL GMs that just fall in love with this kid because the stuff he can do with the football is just really second to none in a lot of ways in college football. So a remarkable player there, and definitely someone that the potential is super high, but haven't quite seen the results that you would love to see. You've seen it in spurts, but not consistently enough to really feel confident, and coming off an injury is always another added variable there. But the skill position players, still awesome. Le'Veon Moss is a fantastic player, followed up by Amari Daniels and Ruben Owens, who I think is going to be a fantastic player for them at running back. So running back is not going to be a problem at all. They're definitely going to be very dominant there. Their O-line isn't necessarily elite, but they definitely have some dudes that can push the pile and make some holes for these guys. And then at wide receiver, you have some dudes. I think this is one of the more underrated wide receiver groups in the entire country. Jade Walker, Noah Thomas, who I think is going to be the player of this team. Moose Muhammad, as you see right there. And Jabri Barber coming over from Troy is huge. This is a really, really fantastic player, and I think he kind of fills the gaps that all of those other guys kind of need filled for them to be an elite offense. And then he added to one of the best tight ends in the country in Donovan Green, and a lot of things are going to go right for that offense. And then you get into this O-line, and it's led by one guy. Trey Zune at left tackle is absolutely huge. Getting your left tackle in place is massive for any offensive line, but they have some other guys that I think are going to make some noise. I think Jace Basantis is a sophomore that is going to be a really, really solid player. Maybe it takes him some time to kind of really get going there, but a very, very solid player, and I think when run blocking is going to be an absolute monster, if I'm being totally honest. And then you move on to the defense. Obviously, you lose guys like Walter Nolan, Jacoby Matthews, and others through the portal, and then Edrin Cooper to the NFL. So a ton to replace, but the foundation's still pretty solid, if I'm being totally honest. Shamar Turner is a absolute beast on the inside. Shamar Stewart is an absolute beast on the outside. So the defensive line at least has those two guys to kind of build off of. You obviously brought in Nick Scourton, which is an absolutely huge person to bring in on that defensive side of the ball, and likely will be their best pass rusher, but at least you have someone like Shamar Stewart to kind of complement him just a little bit. And then Torian York is one of the better linebackers in the conference, in the country, however you want to cut it. This guy is downright special in the middle of that defense and definitely will be a very good player for them this year. And then on the back end, you have Tariq Chappelle coming back, who flirted with the portal, and then another guy who flirted with the portal, Bryce Anderson, who is a very, very talented guy. He's kind of that nickelback that's going to maybe be kind of the leader of this back end, if I'm being totally honest. He's right in the center. He can kind of get everyone in order, is going to play a little corner, is going to play a little safety. So a very, very talented guy, and definitely someone's going to be huge for him. So then when you add that to guys like Nick Scourton, like Solomon DeShields, like Des Ricks on the back end, they've done a really good job of keeping this talent level really, really high and allowing everyone to get going. And then you add Mike Elko calling plays, and it gets really interesting. But at the end of the day, this is a fascinating team. I look at A&M this upcoming year, and obviously there are tons of teams that, as of right now, I would put ahead of them in the SEC. You know, Texas, Georgia, Bama, Ole Miss, Missouri, Tennessee. That might be it. But at the end of the day, even if they're sitting at 7, that's quite a ways behind. But the difference between number 7 and number 3 or 4 is not that much, being totally honest. This is a very dangerous team, and one that, yeah, they were very talented in years past and weren't able to get it done, but they were also the team that everyone was talking about. They were also the team that was on every headline going into SEC Media Days, and were the team that everyone thought was going to hit it big. But at the end of the day, moving in silence might be the best thing for this program, and it's definitely the way that Mike Elko wants to go about business. So it feels like A&M is kind of in a spot where maybe this team is a little bit less talented than the teams they've had in prior years. Maybe they're just a touch worse, but at the end of the day, I think the coaching staff is a touch better, and I think the identity is a touch better, and I think the way that they're going about business is a lot better. So I think that's the biggest difference here, is Texas A&M for the last couple of years just hasn't really felt like Texas A&M to me. It felt like a team that was doing a lot of or just got kind of caught up in the clicks and got caught up in kind of getting covered as one of those big-time teams in the SEC. Now that they're a little bit in the dark, a little bit back in the background a little bit more, I think they're ready to attack, and they have everything in place to do that. So it'll be really awesome to watch. Absolutely love Mike Elko and love that hire. So it's going to be awesome to watch. And if Connor Wegman gets rolling, is a really, really dangerous team. I'm just going to put that out there. But we'll take our third break here, and when we come back, we got a recruiting update for you guys. LSU absolutely dominated this weekend, but a number of other teams had some very, very big commitments, including Baylor, just on an absolute tear on the recruiting trail. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about Texas A&M and how they're kind of moving a little bit more in silence than they have in past years, and I think it's the best thing for them, that's for sure. But let's move on to recruiting here, and let's break down some of the big-time things that happened this weekend, and it was an LSU show. They got 2 big-time commitments that absolutely turned the recruiting world on its head because frankly, I didn't expect them to get either of them. So let's get into this and let's break down some of the commitments. We will get to LSU, but I do want to start with A&M, the team that we just talked about. They picked up a huge commitment from Kelshawn Johnson, a very talented wide receiver that is just outright speed. 5'11", 161, a very talented kid and someone that Texas was really after. After they lost out on Decoria Moore to Oregon, it felt like Texas really turned up the heat on this recruitment among some other recruitments that are coming up here pretty soon. So a big-time win for A&M to kind of fend them off and give their offense, that Anaya Smith type energy that you can just throw a ball deep and know he's going to be down there at some point, or do a jet sweep and he's going to get gone really quickly. But then let's move on to the team that won the weekend, the LSU Tigers. The LSU Tigers got a huge commitment from 5-star cornerback DJ Pickett. This was back on Friday just after the show. So 6'4", 180, a very lengthy receiver, very good ball skills, someone that is very, very dangerous on the outside, and is ranked number 3 cornerback in the entire country according to number 1 cornerback in the country, number 3 overall recruit in the country. So a very, very talented guy, a huge get for LSU. This is the 3rd guy they've got at the number 1 spot in their position in this entire class. Bryce Underwood and Harlem Berry were the number 1 at quarterback and running back respectively. Now they just added the number 1 cornerback, and it feels like they're finally getting things rolling over there. Corey Raymond is known for elite recruiting, and that's exactly what he's doing. And it's really interesting because there were a lot of crystal balls going towards the Oregon Ducks, and LSU came in the 9th hour and stole them away. So it'll be really, really interesting to see what this kid can do, and he might just have to be a starter year 1 with all of the questions in that back end of that defense. And then they got another huge one. Derek Meadows is a 5-star wide receiver that has committed to LSU. Cortez Hankton, as you see in that picture, getting to work on the recruiting trail. Another fantastic recruiter that LSU brought in this offseason, but another huge get. Notre Dame was someone that was heavily pushing for him, and Deuce Knight, the future quarterback for Notre Dame, was pushing for him very aggressively. But at the end of the day, I think Notre Dame might just be a year away from really getting that wide receiver recruiting where it needs to be. And I think the guy that can kind of open those doors is Jaden Greathouse. He came in as a freshman last year, played really good football for the time that, for being a freshman, for being on the field the amount he was. I think he played really good football, but let's say he takes a big step forward this year, especially with Riley Leonard throwing in passes, and he can kind of get rolling. I think recruits will listen to that, and they'll see that this is probably the place that I want to be. So I think this is one that Notre Dame really wanted, but it was going to be tough to beat out Cortez Hankton and LSU for a wide receiver right about now. So that's definitely one that didn't necessarily surprise me quite as much as the DJ Pickett one, but still a fantastic pickup for LSU. Ohio State got in on the party as they often do. Jarquez Carter is a very talented defensive lineman, 6'2", 280, so not necessarily the biggest guy in the world, but definitely a very, very talented guy on the interior of that defense. And if you're Larry Johnson, he's going to be able to get big-time recruits. As long as he is the defensive line coach in Columbus, Ohio, the Buckeyes are going to have dudes up front. I can promise you that. This guy is absolutely remarkable at recruiting, at development, at everything in between. So definitely someone that Ohio State's just got to hold on to with both hands and never let go, if I'm being totally honest. But let's move on to the team that maybe has been the biggest surprise over the last couple of weeks. The Baylor Bears are going to absolute work. I would have picture with him in Baylor gear, but couldn't find it because this one came out of the dark too, if I'm being totally honest. Michael Turner is a very talented 4-star running back out of North Richland Hills, Texas. A very, very talented kid. Had offers from SMU, Oklahoma State, Utah. So a very talented kid. Number 5 running back in this class, according to On3. So after Taz Williams committing to this program, they're just absolutely cooking over there. And Dave Aranda is one of those guys that is going into 2024 with not necessarily a ton of hype around his team, not necessarily a ton of love, but if he can get to 5 wins, I think he keeps his job. And if he can keep these guys committed, then things might just get really interesting over there in Waco. And it's been quite some time since we've seen Baylor be a big-time team in that Big 12, but we know they can be based on the past. But let's move on to Clemson here, and Bryce Davis, a huge pickup, 4-star edge, 6'4", 255, just exactly what you want from an edge rusher, someone that is really, really talented. Pick them over Georgia and Duke were the 2 other teams really vying for him. And this is kind of just business as usual for the Tigers. They're going to get elite defensive linemen. They're going to get elite linebackers. They're going to do work, essentially, at those 2 positions. It's been the thing that has happened every single year since Dabo took over, and that's not changing anytime soon. I can almost promise you that. But let's move on to Tennessee. They picked up a big-time linebacker commit, Christian Gaz, a very talented player, 6'3", 225, out of Covington, Georgia. So a very talented guy, top 85 recruit this year, and someone that definitely is kind of adding to a really, really interesting thing that's happening at Tennessee, where obviously we knew they were going to be able to recruit offensively. When you have Josh Heupel and you have that offense, especially what they had in 2022, you're going to have the ability to recruit the skill positions on offense. What they've done on defense has been remarkable. They continue to add really, really high-level guys, and it's making it where Tennessee doesn't have to beat people 42-45 or 52-45. They have to beat people 24-21. It doesn't necessarily always have to be pretty, and that's kind of the big next step, right? That's the big step for Tennessee and Josh Heupel to take, where they can become a big-time SEC player if they continue to build out this defense. What's up, D-Money? How you doing? Floyd Boucard is someone I want to talk about because he is coming all the way from Montreal, Quebec, which is very, very interesting. A guy that is a little, I'm sure, is a little bit rough around the edges, definitely more of a project-type guy, but 6'4", 315 defensive lineman. You want that guy on your roster, and you'll figure out everything else later. I promise you that. He's a very, very talented guy, and always really cool when you see someone from outside the U.S. make that jump into college football, and something tells me this might just be a real big-time player in a couple of years here. UGA just continues to do UGA things, bring in big-time offensive linemen, and Cortez Smith is just the most recent among them, a very talented guy that got offers from absolutely everywhere, but Miami was really the big battle here, and again, business as usual. Stacy Searles has done absolutely incredible work on the trail since he's taken over for Matt Luke there, and he's going to continue doing that. That's not stopping anytime soon, I can almost promise you that. So, a very talented guy and someone that definitely can help UGA almost right away with both their guards, Dylan Fairchild and Tate Ratledge, likely moving on after this year. But let's move on to Miami. They got a huge commit from Jabari Antoine, a very talented corner that they absolutely needed. After missing out on someone like DJ Pickett, you need to be able to fill that position somehow, and they filled it really, really well with this kid. A very talented guy and someone that I definitely think is going to make some noise pretty early on during his career because, frankly, that's probably the biggest hole for Miami as you move on to the next little bit is that back end of that defense, and if you can add those elite recruits more and more, then you're off running. So this is definitely a kid that could pop up the very first year when he's in Coral Gables and make some noise. And then finally, Vernell Brown III made his decision. He's committed to Florida, and that's something that I've talked about on here a little bit before. He had offers from Ohio State, Miami, Florida State, and he picked Florida. And I need people to understand that there is something being sold in those doors that is different, that recruits are responding to, that they obviously see in that building, and I don't know. I'm not saying that Florida's going to tear people apart this year. I'm not saying they're going to go, 9-3 and make a playoff or anything crazy, but this is a program that is really working fairly well comparatively to what they're doing on the football field. So it's a really, really interesting thing to watch, and definitely getting a guy like this is going to be a huge boost to that. So maybe Billy Napier doesn't win a ton of games this year, but with the recruiting class he's bringing in, you might just want to keep him around. So it'll be fascinating to watch that unfold. But then finally, I kind of want to get into the big-time commitments that are coming up in August. We have tons of 5-stars that are committing this August, and I want to give some predictions for them. So let's get underway here. Jared Smith is a 5-star edge. He is committing on the 3rd of August. I'm going to go Auburn here. I feel pretty confident in that. It feels like everything is trending towards Auburn. South Carolina is going to make a push here late, but I'd lean towards Auburn winning this one out. And then Trey McNutt, a 5-star safety, a very, very talented young kid, committing on the exact same day. I think this one's going to be Oregon. I think Ohio State wants this one really, really bad, especially after losing some other commitments to Oregon, but I just think it's going to be too much. I think Oregon's going to win this one out, but if anyone was to steal this one, I think it would be Ohio State. You got Khalil Lockett is going to commit shortly after that on the 7th at 2:41 p.m. for some reason. I don't know why it's so specific, but I do think he's going to pick Texas. I know A&M's pushing really hard. I know Bama is pushing probably harder than anyone else, but I like to think Texas is going to get it done. There's no two ways about that. And then you have Josh Petty, a very talented 5-star offensive tackle. He's committing on the 12th. It's going to be Florida State. I feel very confident in that. Georgia Tech's the other team that's really pushing here, but you're fighting an uphill battle, I'll be totally honest. David Sanders Jr., the number 1 offensive tackle in the country, is committing shortly after that on the 17th. It's going to be Georgia. I feel pretty confident in that. I think Nebraska's going to push. I think Ohio State's the real threat, but I think it's going to be Georgia at the end of the day. And then I think Texas finishes out with 2 big-time ones at the end of the month on the 30th with Michael Fasusi, a 5-star offensive tackle, and Jamie French, a 5-star wide receiver. Very, very talented guys, and I think both of them are going to pick Texas. I know Fasusi is definitely leaning a lot towards A&M and definitely is going to be a very tough one, tough battle down the stretch, but Texas holds a slight lead right now, and I feel confident that they will continue that slight lead as they move forward. So very much like a lot of these players, and I think when you get into recruiting around this time of year, you can kind of take it with a grain of salt. You know, this is obviously a huge time of recruiting and one of those times that you absolutely need to execute, but there still is December. There still is time to kind of lock down some of these. So some are not so panicked. Some should be panicking a little bit more than they are. But at the end of the day, it is going to be crazy over the next couple of weeks with recruiting. And it's not going to come to an end until signing day. That's for sure. And then it starts right back over again. That's the beauty of recruiting. But we'll take our last break here. And when we come back, we got contender hot takes for you. Kind of a new segment around here. We'll do the Big 12 today and kind of work our way through all the Power 4 conferences and just give a hot take for a lot of these teams. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just did a little bit of a recruiting update and someone just bring up a great point. Deion Sanders is making some big moves, and frankly I think one of the biggest ones is going to be dropping here pretty soon in the way of a very talented quarterback, and I'll leave that at that right there, but we'll see what happens with that. Finally, let's get into some hot takes around some of the conference contenders. The Big 12 is where we'll start, and then we'll make our way through all of the Power 4 conferences and probably dip our toe into some of the big-time contenders in the Group of 5, So let's jump in here, and the number one I want to talk about is Utah and Cam Rising. And I think Cam Rising is going to have the best statistical season of his career. I think he's going to be just remarkable this upcoming season. And this is one I feel really good about, if I'm being totally honest. His best year was 2022. He had over 3,000 yards passing, 26 touchdowns, 8 picks. Kind of just going about business. He led his team to a Pac-12 title and ruined USC's fun in that first year of Caleb Williams over there in Southern California. So it was a fantastic year for him. I think this one's even better, and I think the guys around him is a huge reason for that. Let's start with Dorian Singer, who, frankly, I think is the best wide receiver Cam Rising has ever had the chance to throw the ball to. He's had a ton of really talented guys, and I will say wide receiver because Dalton Kincaid is an absolute dog, and I don't want to put him like that, but Dorian Singer is remarkably talented and definitely unlocks a part of this offense that was just a little bit hard to unlock before. It was definitely something that you felt like there was just that little bit more that this offense could do, and if they could do that, things got really, really interesting. I think they got that guy. And then Money Parks is going to take another step forward, an absolute terrifying deep threat, and every time he has the ball in his hands, it gets really, really interesting. And then you have Micah Pittman, a fantastic route runner, someone that I absolutely think is going to be huge on third downs and those really, really big money downs. And then you have Tayshawn Lyons, was a huge portal pickup, a ton of really, really good things going into 2023. Brent Kuthi, the guy on that screen, is coming back after what was a rough 2023 for him as well. So him and Cam Rising were kind of on the same page last year. Hopefully they're on the same page this year, and they'll definitely be able to really make some noise with the just ridiculous amount of guys that they have. And then you add on to that I think Utah could absolutely roll through this Big 12 schedule, go to the Big 12 title, win it, and then be a top 4 seed in the college football playoff. I think that would be comfortably Cam Rising's best year, and I think he would ride off into the sunset with that. So I'm expecting a ton from Cam Rising this year, and a lot of things are in place for him to do that, that's for sure. Let's move on to Kansas State, and let's talk about Avery Johnson. I think he's going to finish top 5 in Heisman voting. I think that's how good this kid is. He is downright special, and he's someone that he's the reason that Will Howard is the starting quarterback at Ohio State. And it's not that he's the starting quarterback at Tulane. He's not the starting quarterback at Troy or at Wake Forest or any of the smaller schools that he could have gone to. He's the starting quarterback as maybe the team that you favor to win the title most. And the reason is that guy is on this team. Avery Johnson is that different. He is absolutely insane, and he played in limited time a year ago, but 5 passing touchdowns, 0 picks, 296 yards on the ground, 7 scores. Obviously did not have the best completion percentage. That's obviously the place that he needs to take the biggest step forward, but he's got plenty of arm. He's got plenty of ability to push the ball down the field, and it sounds like him and Matt Wells are on the exact same page since he's shown up on campus, Matt Wells being the new OC. A very, very, very good thing for them and definitely can open up this offense a ton. So the run game is going to be the headline for this team. There's no two ways about that. DJ Giddens is someone that is going to have a huge year for them, I expect. And then you have one of the best pass-catching backs in the entire country in Dylan Edwards from Colorado. So a lot of things are happening really, really well for this team. But the reality is, this kid is just going to be the most special thing on this team. There's no two ways about that. And when you have those 2 running backs in the backfield that the linebacker has to worry about, or in DJ Giddens, they have to pack the box just a little bit more, those read options are going to have some big-time openings, and you don't want to give this guy big-time openings. I'll just put it that way. And then the passing game. J.C. Brown is going to be the go-to guy for good reason. He's one of the best wide receivers in the conference. But you do have Keegan Johnson. Dante Cephas had a interesting year over in Penn State, but if he can get back to the football that he was playing up in Kent State, he's going to be really, really talented for this kid. And it's a scary thought for all Big 12 fans, but they have another Lockett on that team. Sterling Lockett is someone that's kind of coming up the ranks as a young player, and the last time around, Tyler Lockett was an absolute menace across the Big 12, so definitely will be really, really interesting. I wish I could say he could be a Heisman finalist, but when I look across the SEC and the Big 10, and I see the number of quarterbacks in particular that I think are going to put up ridiculous numbers and maybe have a better record and be in the better conference hypothetically than Avery Johnson, I tend to believe he's just going to miss out, but he's going to be really in that conversation, and frankly, I would love to see him in New York at the end of the year. But let's move on to Kansas, and it's all about Devin Neal for me. I think this guy is going to lead the conference in rushing yards, and that one's a little bit out there. That's definitely maybe the hottest one on here, if I'm being totally honest, but I think he's one of those guys that's just due for a big-time breakout season. He's only been getting better throughout his time at Kansas, was about 1,200 yards rushing a year ago. Now that puts him comfortably behind Ollie Gordon, who was about at 1,700, and Taj Brooks, who was about 1,500. So definitely needs a little bit of help here, but he does have something that those two don't, which is a mobile quarterback, and I think that opens a lot of doors for him, the same way that, DJ Giddens opens doors for Avery Johnson. It's going to be the same thing, but just inverse. I think Jalen Daniels is going to open doors for Devin Neal in this run game. And then you have Daniel Highshaw, obviously, is going to help out a lot here, going to be that kind of change of pace back, maybe more of a third down back type guy, but I don't think he's going to get the bulk of the carries, and frankly, I think it's going to be a little bit even more towards Devin Neal this upcoming year. So I think that's kind of the big thing here. You have Jalen Daniels. If he is healthy, that's huge for this team because it opens up so many things in this passing game that you just didn't have late last season and late in the past couple of seasons with Jason Bean under center. There was a lot of stacking the box. There was a lot of saying they're going to run the ball, and if they don't run the ball, they're not going to pass it very effectively, so we're not super worried. If Jalen Daniels is on the field, then you have to worry about the pass, and then things get a little bit more interesting. So I think they've done a great job. They added some really good offensive linemen, returning 3 starters, and brought in Bryce Foster, a really talented center from A&M, so a very, very talented group, and I think Devin Neal is one of those guys that you might not know his name right now, or at least some people might not know his name right now, but they absolutely will by the end of the season. But let's move on to Oklahoma State here. Alan Bowman is someone that's really interesting this year and maybe one of the most important players in the entire conference this upcoming year, but he's someone that really dodged a lot of bullets a year ago. He went 15 touchdowns, 14 picks a year ago, and that is crazy to think that that was a team that made the Big 12 title game, but he threw a pick in at least 9 of the 14 games that Oklahoma State played. It wasn't very pretty in that respect, and I think this is kind of just who he is. There was not a lot of seasons in his past where he had a full season where he didn't throw double-digit picks, and frankly, I think that's probably what's going to happen this year, and I think it's just going to catch up to him this time around. I think there's going to be too many games that last year they were able to escape from, where he just either didn't throw a touchdown pass or didn't do much of anything, honestly, and they were just able to ride Ollie Gordon. Now guys are going to be able to stack the box, and you're playing teams like Utah, like Kansas State, who I think is stronger on the defensive line. I think Kansas is a little bit stronger on the defensive line, so I think that's kind of the biggest difference here is everyone knows what Oklahoma State wants to do. Everyone knows that it's going to be the Ollie Gordon show, so force them to pass. Stack the box, force them to make that hard decision, and then you might just get a couple from Alan Bowman. So I think he's a very talented guy, and he's behind a really, really good offensive line. So he could take that step forward. He could kind of fix some of those mistakes. But when a guy's been in the college football for at least 5 years playing in some form or another, and he's throwing picks at least a good amount of times throughout those years, I think it gives you at least enough of a reason to worry. And then finally here, I want to break down, got one more here. Obviously, Ollie Gordon's going to be the show, but Alan Bowman's the guy that decides how good Oklahoma State's season is. But let's get into Colorado, and let's talk about Travis Hunter, because a very talented kid. There's no two ways about that. Frankly, one of the best pure football players in the entire country. You could easily make the argument that he is the best pure football player in the country. I don't think he's going to be their leading receiver this upcoming year. And frankly, I don't know how hot that is. Maybe a Colorado fan can tell me how hot that is. But when you're coming back as the leading receiver, Xavier Weaver walked out to the NFL. So if Travis Hunter, coming back as the returning leading receiver, then maybe he's the top, and he's going to be the top choice for Shedeur. You would have to assume that he'd be the top receiver. I just don't see that to be the case, and the two guys that I look at most readily are the two guys that they brought in from the transfer portal, and I'll start with Will Shepard here. He's someone that, frankly, I'm a little less confident in to be that guy, but is a very, very talented kid. A big body that can absolutely go up and get those 50-50 balls downfield. Had 3 500-plus yards receiving seasons at Vandy. Someone that can definitely open up stuff for this offense and be, whether it's a red zone threat or someone just on the outside to take up that safety's attention as he goes deep downfield, I don't know. But at the end of the day, a very talented guy and someone that could really open up this offense just a little bit more for Shedeur Sanders and the Buffs. But the guy that I'm watching more than anyone else, maybe in this entire conference, but especially on this team, LeJontay Wester is so huge for this team. He's coming over from FAU where he had over 1,100 yards a year ago, and definitely someone that is going to be really talented. He is a yak beast. Yards after catch, he just absolutely dominates. He's so incredible with the ball in his hands, and I think, frankly, if Colorado's going to do the things that they want to do this upcoming season, I think this has to be the case. I think Travis Hunter can't be the leading receiver because then you're asking to be the leading receiver and be the top guy on defense, and that's just too much to ask of one guy, even if that guy is a outright superhuman like Travis Hunter is. I do think that's not necessarily a winning formula. So I think those two guys need to be huge, and I think LeJontay Wester is the guy that in particular I'm watching most closely because I think he's just downright special, if I'm being totally honest. And I think he might just be an all Big 12 type guy at the end of the year. But it's going to be really interesting to watch all of that unfold. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference for us. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all the content and updates you could possibly need. We just have incredible people covering every single sport, and it's going to be awesome to watch. There's no two ways about that. I cannot wait either. I'm being totally honest. Hawaiian 5-0 absolutely is 100% correct. Just cannot wait to get into this season. And I personally cannot place bets because I'm in Georgia, but everyone else, have your fun. Definitely, and I will do my best to steer you in the right direction. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.
Let's go.